They didn't leave because they stopped feeling. They disappeared because they felt too much. What they cannot face is not you. It is the part of themselves that awakens when you stand before them. If this resonates, if you felt this sudden distancing, this silent withdrawal, pause for a moment and reflect. Not on what you did wrong, but on what truth you represented. And if this understanding is clarifying something long confusing, stay with this exploration. Shame in the narcissistic psyche is not experienced as weakness, but as a catastrophic threat to the structure that keeps the ego intact. From a depth psychological perspective, shame emerges when the split between the constructed persona and the disowned inner life becomes momentarily visible. The narcissist does not lack feeling. Rather, feeling has been exiled into the shadow because it once signaled vulnerability, dependence, or rejection. Shame carries the emotional memory of that exile. It is not simply embarrassment or guilt, but a profound awareness that the self being presented to the world is not the self that exists within. This awareness cannot be tolerated consciously, so it is defended against with denial, grandiosity, projection, and avoidance. The shadow, filled with unmet needs, envy, fear, and grief, presses for recognition, but the ego resists integration because doing so would dismantle the very identity that ensured psychological survival. When shame is activated, it destabilizes the narcissist's internal hierarchy, threatening the illusion of superiority and control that protects them from psychic fragmentation. Instead of being processed, shame is externalized. Others are blamed, devalued, or erased so the ego can restore equilibrium. This is why shame feels annihilating rather than humbling. It is experienced as a collapse of being rather than an emotion to be reflected upon. The refusal to face shame is therefore not arrogance alone, but a desperate attempt to prevent the unconscious from flooding consciousness with truths the ego is not equipped to hold. In this sense, shame is not a moral failure, but an unresolved encounter with the shadow that remains sealed off, shaping behavior from behind the scenes, determining who must be avoided, silenced, or discarded to preserve psychic continuity. Avoidance in the narcissistic psyche functions as a primary defense mechanism rather than a sign of emotional detachment or indifference. From a depth psychological standpoint, avoidance arises when the ego encounters material from the unconscious that threatens its coherence. The narcissist's identity is constructed around control, admiration, and psychological distance from vulnerability. When a person, situation, or memory activates unresolved inner conflict, the psyche moves to eliminate contact with the source of activation. Avoidance becomes a protective reflex, preserving the fragile equilibrium of the ego, rather than consciously engaging with discomfort. The narcissist withdraws, reframes, or disappears, not to punish the other, but to regulate internal distress. This retreat is automatic and largely unconscious. It prevents the emergence of feelings that could destabilize the persona, such as shame, dependency, inadequacy, or longing. In this sense, avoidance is not passivity, but psychic survival. The narcissist cannot remain present with what evokes self-reflection because reflection risks exposure of the split between who they appear to be and who they fear they are. The more emotionally significant the encounter, the stronger the avoidance response becomes. This is why meaningful relationships often end abruptly or are slowly starved of intimacy. The psyche interprets closeness as danger, because closeness dissolves illusion. Avoidance allows the narcissist to maintain a sense of mastery while bypassing the internal work required for growth. It creates the appearance of autonomy while reinforcing inner dependence on defenses. Over time, this pattern hardens into a repetitive cycle where retreat replaces transformation and distance substitutes for insight. What remains unprocessed does not disappear, but accumulates in the unconscious, silently shaping future behaviors, relationships, and perceptions, ensuring that avoidance becomes not just a response, but a defining structure of the personality itself. When your presence begins to mirror the narcissist's inner reality, it disrupts the carefully maintained division between consciousness and the unconscious. In depth psychology, projection allows unwanted aspects of the self to be placed onto others, keeping the ego clean and idealized. But when someone sees through the persona and relates to the authentic emotional core, projection fails. The narcissist is no longer able to externalize discomfort because the other person reflects it back with accuracy. This reflection is not created by confrontation or accusation, but by consistency, emotional attunement, and psychological clarity. Simply existing as someone who perceives them truthfully becomes enough to activate internal conflict. The mirror effect occurs because the narcissist recognizes, often unconsciously, that the other sees what they have disowned. This recognition evokes shame, grief, and fear simultaneously. Shame arises from the awareness of inauthenticity, grief from the loss of the unlived self, and fear from the threat of ego disintegration. The psyche experiences this as exposure rather than intimacy. Instead of feeling known, the narcissist feels invaded. The mirror destabilizes the illusion that the persona is the self. This is intolerable because the persona is not merely a social mask, but a psychological structure that ensures survival. When you reflect their contradictions, unmet needs, or emotional dependency without rescuing or idealizing them, the unconscious registers danger. The narcissist may respond with withdrawal, hostility, or erasure because removing the mirror restores psychic distance. What is avoided is not the relationship, but the internal reckoning it provokes. Your presence becomes symbolic rather than personal, representing the truth they cannot metabolize. In this way, the relationship shifts from being about connection to being about confrontation with the self. The psyche resolves this conflict not through growth, but through separation, preserving the split and silencing the reflection that threaten to make the unconscious conscious. The ego in the narcissistic structure survives by exiling the authentic self because authenticity once became associated with danger, rejection, or psychic pain. Early experiences taught the psyche that spontaneous feeling, need, or dependency did not lead to safety, but to injury. In response, the ego constructed a substitute identity built on performance, control, and superiority. This false center becomes the organizing principle of consciousness, while the authentic self, tender, uncertain, relational, is pushed into the unconscious. The exile is not accidental, it is a survival strategy. The ego learns that to remain intact, it must never allow the buried self to surface. Over time, this internal division hardens into structure. The narcissist no longer experiences the split as a choice, but as reality itself. The persona feels real, while the authentic self feels vague, threatening, or unreal. Yet the exiled self does not disappear. It continues to exist in the shadow, carrying unmet needs, longing, rage, and grief. The energy required to keep this self suppressed is immense, and the ego becomes rigid in order to maintain control. Any situation that invites emotional honesty or mutual vulnerability threatens to dissolve the boundary between the false and the real. When this boundary weakens, anxiety emerges, not because the narcissist fears intimacy itself, but because intimacy invites the return of what was banished. To face the authentic self would mean acknowledging the cost of the exile, the loss of genuine connection, the emptiness beneath admiration, the grief of a life partially unlived. This awareness risks psychic collapse because the ego was never built to integrate complexity, only to defend against it. Thus, the narcissist clings to the constructed identity even when it becomes isolating because the alternative feels like annihilation. The ego survives, but at the price of wholeness, maintaining continuity by keeping the true self at a distance, ensuring that survival is achieved not through integration but through permanent internal separation. For the narcissistic psyche, being truly seen is far more threatening than being left behind. Abandonment can be narrated, rationalized, and reframed as superiority, independence, or victimhood, but being seen penetrates defenses that abandonment never touches. To be seen means that another person perceives the inner contradictions, the hunger beneath grandiosity, the fear beneath control. This perception bypasses the persona and reaches the disowned self that has been hidden for survival. From a depth psychological view, the narcissist fears exposure not because of moral failure, but because visibility collapses the illusion that the constructed identity is whole and sufficient. When someone sees beyond the performance and still remains present, the psyche loses its usual escape routes. There is no projection to rely on, no narrative strong enough to dismiss the truth reflected back. This creates an experience of psychic nakedness. The narcissist does not feel understood. They feel stripped. Being seen awakens the buried awareness that the persona is compensatory, that it exists to cover a deficit rather than express an essence. This awareness evokes shame and grief simultaneously. Shame arises from the recognition of inauthenticity, and grief from the realization that a more genuine self was sacrificed long ago. Abandonment, by contrast, confirms the narcissist's internal myth that closeness is unsafe and that self-reliance is necessary. It reinforces defenses rather than dismantling them. Being seen threatens to undo the very structure that protects the ego from fragmentation. This is why the narcissist may tolerate loss, but cannot tolerate intimacy that includes perception. The moment someone holds an accurate inner image of them, the unconscious registers danger. Withdrawal then becomes necessary, not to avoid the other person, but to extinguish the gaze that makes self-deception impossible. In this sense, being seen represents a psychological reckoning, while abandonment remains a familiar wound that the ego already knows how to survive. The collapse of the narcissistic structure begins internally, long before it manifests in observable behavior or relational breakdown. From a depth psychological perspective, collapse does not arrive as a single dramatic event, but as a slow erosion of the defenses that once held the ego together. The persona continues to function outwardly, often appearing intact, confident, or even superior, while internally the psyche experiences growing strain. The strategies that once regulated shame, emptiness, and fear begin to lose effectiveness. Admiration no longer restores equilibrium, control feels increasingly brittle, and avoidance requires greater psychic effort. This internal instability is largely unconscious, which is why the narcissist may appear unchanged even as the inner structure weakens. The ego senses threat, but cannot name it, leading to heightened reactivity, rigidity, or compulsive repetition of familiar patterns. The unconscious presses for recognition, not to destroy the ego, but to be integrated. However, because integration was never learned, this pressure is experienced as danger rather than opportunity. The narcissist responds by intensifying defenses, clinging more tightly to the persona, and eliminating sources of emotional challenge. This creates a paradox. The more the ego defends itself, the more brittle it becomes. Small disruptions begin to feel catastrophic. Minor losses trigger disproportionate reactions. Relationships fracture not because of sudden insight, but because the psyche can no longer sustain the internal cost of maintaining illusion. The collapse remains invisible to others until a critical threshold is crossed, at which point withdrawal, devaluation, or abrupt disengagement occurs. These outward actions are not the beginning of collapse, but its consequence. Internally, the psyche has already fractured along the fault lines created by years of repression and avoidance. What appears sudden is actually delayed, the final expression of an inner process long underway, shaped by unintegrated shadow material and an ego structure built to defend rather than to transform. The collapse of the narcissistic structure begins internally, long before it manifests in observable behavior or relational breakdown. From a depth psychological perspective, collapse does not arrive as a single dramatic event, but as a slow erosion of the defenses that once held the ego together. The persona continues to function outwardly, often appearing intact, confident or even superior, while internally the psyche experiences growing strain. The strategies that once regulated shame, emptiness, and fear begin to lose effectiveness. Admiration no longer restores equilibrium, control feels increasingly brittle, and avoidance requires greater psychic effort. This internal instability is largely unconscious, which is why the narcissist may appear unchanged even as the inner structure weakens. The ego senses threat but cannot name it, leading to heightened reactivity, rigidity, or compulsive repetition of familiar patterns. The unconscious presses for recognition, not to destroy the ego, but to be integrated. However, because integration was never learned, this pressure is experienced as danger rather than opportunity. The narcissist responds by intensifying defenses, clinging more tightly to the persona, and eliminating sources of emotional challenge. This creates a paradox. The more the ego defends itself, the more brittle it becomes. Small disruptions begin to feel catastrophic. Minor losses trigger disproportionate reactions. Relationships fracture not because of sudden insight, but because the psyche can no longer sustain the internal cost of maintaining illusion. The collapse remains invisible to others until a critical threshold is crossed, at which point withdrawal, devaluation, or abrupt disengagement occurs. These outward actions are not the beginning of collapse, but its consequence. Internally, the psyche has already fractured along the fault lines created by years of repression and avoidance. What appears sudden is actually delayed, the final expression of an inner process long underway, shaped by unintegrated shadow material and an ego structure built to defend rather than to transform. When you become a living symbol for the narcissist, the relationship shifts from a personal connection to a psychological representation of what has been denied within the self. In depth psychology, symbols carry concentrated meaning that the conscious mind cannot fully articulate. You no longer exist merely as an individual, but as an embodiment of qualities the narcissist has split off and buried in the unconscious. These qualities may include emotional authenticity, moral consistency, mutuality, or the capacity for genuine attachment. Your presence activates these disowned elements not through accusation, but through contrast. By living in a way that reflects coherence between inner values and outer behavior, you silently expose the fracture within the narcissistic psyche. The ego interprets this not as inspiration, but as threat, because symbols bypass rational defenses and speak directly to the unconscious. You remind them, without words, of the self they might have been had they not chosen survival through dissociation and performance. This symbolic role is intolerable because it forces an implicit comparison between the persona and the unlived life. The narcissist may not consciously understand why your presence feels destabilizing, but the psyche recognizes you as a carrier of meaning that disrupts internal denial. This is why erasure becomes necessary. Eliminating the symbol restores psychic equilibrium by removing the reminder of loss, grief, and inauthenticity. The act of distancing is not about power over you, but about power over the inner image you evoke. Yet symbols cannot truly be destroyed. Even in absence, the meaning persists in the unconscious, shaping dreams, reactions, and future relationships. You remain a reference point the psyche must avoid replicating. In this way, you continue to exist not in their life, but in their inner landscape, representing the truth they could not integrate, the wholeness they could not risk, and the self they could not face. In the end, what appears as avoidance, silence, or disappearance is not victory, indifference, or emotional detachment. It is the psyche protecting itself from a truth it was never prepared to hold. The narcissist cannot face you because you represent integration, and integration demands the courage to confront the shadow rather than flee from it. Shame becomes their silent punishment, not because it is inflicted from the outside, but because it arises from an inner awareness that something essential was sacrificed for survival. You move forward carrying insight, grief, and growth, while they remain bound to repetition, defending an identity that must constantly be reinforced and never truly inhabited. Your presence marked a threshold they could not cross, a mirror they could not endure, and a truth they could not metabolize. And so the punishment is quiet, invisible, and enduring. To live without wholeness, avoiding the very encounters that might have led to it, trapped not by you, but by the unresolved self they continue to flee.